Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of the show, bringing a really awesome guest for you today. And today on the show, we are going to be exploring one of the most fascinating challenges facing the future of humanity, and that is, if we ultimately establish permanent settlements on the moon or on Mars or in some fancy orbital habitat, ultimately how we will produce food, recycle water, regenerate air, and create these truly self-sustaining ecosystems. And as such, joining us today, we have Mark Ciotola, who is a Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of a company called Sustain Space, where he works on technologies designed to make human space exploration more sustainable through regenerative life support systems and space agriculture. And through the company's Orbital Genomics initiative, Mark and his collaborators are studying ultimately how plants respond to the very unique stresses of spaceflight, how these insights ultimately help feed future astronauts while simultaneously creating learnings for improving agriculture here on Earth. Mark's background spans everything from NASA to Carnegie Mellon, Monash University, San Francisco State University, and Singularity University. And he has worked across space sciences, entrepreneurship, technology commercialization, education, and innovation. And ultimately, his career is focused on this central question that is becoming increasingly important, and ultimately how we create these resilient biologic systems capable of supporting humanity's expansion into space and at the same time creating more sustainable civilization for us on Earth. A lot of cool topics to get into today. An honor to have him. Mark Ciotola, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ira.
Great having you. A lot to get into, Mark, but before we do any of that and jump into sort of the biology of becoming a spacefaring civilization, I would just love to hand things over to you. I mean, you've worked across, so many different areas, as I mentioned in your bio. Tell us a little about your background and where this all started, because you've been on quite a journey.
Sure. I went to, actually, I've been a space enthusiast for all my life. When I was a child, I remember watching the big rockets launching off, that sort of thing. It was really exciting, but then space, there was a time when it was literally a desert for space efforts. They're trying to get the shuttle up, but that was taking longer than expected. Skylab was longer in existence. Budgets were being cut. And so I was thinking NASA has the best scientists in the world, but they're being clobbered in politics. So I went into politics in college, got quite involved, extremely involved, was living, eating, breathing it, uh, and had some success. But then this fellow named John Glenn, he's an astronaut and then became a US Senator, and he decided he'd run for president. So some of the space enthusiasts were supporting him for president. And although he was polling #2 in the national polls, he just wasn't really prepared for primary politics. You have to first win your party before you win the general election. And he got clobbered, and therefore we got clobbered. So that's a lesson for politics. Sometimes you love space, but you have to balance it with other considerations. So I went to law school, and I was fortunate enough to go to a law school that was actually spun off from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It was called Franklin Pierce, and it's now still Franklin Pierce, but it's part of the University of New Hampshire College of Law, School of Law, I should say. And there's a really neat thing. There are lots of engineers running around, people from the patent office coming and going. And I used that to get an internship at NASA, the NASA Ames Legal Research Center, where I worked for a chief counsel, J. Henry Glazer, who was quite a character. And anyway, he was a mentor to me as well. And so I worked there for a while and got involved in technology transfer. Um, Unfortunately, with aerospace, it goes through funding ups and downs. We talked about that before, and was going through another one. And so I jumped ship. And at about the same time, this whole thing called the World Wide Web, and all this IT stuff was happening. And so I had an opportunity to work for a series of companies doing computers. So in law school, like I said, we had a lot of geeks and techies, and we had all sorts of brand new computers and all sorts of things to plan and learn on. And I continued that learning. And so I jumped out of the kind of the legal realm into the IT realm. I got to work for a series of amazing companies. The most relevant for this talk is Genentech and Applied Biosystems. Genentech, it was bought by Roche, but it's a big company. It's one of the pioneers of biotechnology. And what they do is they bioengineer cells, and then they grow cells into big, huge globs of cells that are like literally in 3-story high tanks. And then at some point, they grow enough cells and they squeeze the medicine they're trying to make out of them. And so when I'm in a place, I try to learn as much as I can about what they're doing and how they're doing it, even try to replicate it. And it's really amazing. It's almost like being in a spaceship in some of their, let's say, production facilities. It was all mechanics and tanks and stuff. Is really a mixture of biology and kind of mechanical technology. Anyway, that made an impression on me. And of course, at that time, I also wanted to see if you could grow animal cells. Like you can actually grow animal cells in a lab. It was established. I tried to grow chicken cells. I thought, well, I'll make myself some chicken meat. You know what I mean? And myself and a couple of students at San Francisco State University began doing it. However, you have to be really careful of contamination. And if you don't, it can be a really smelly mess. And so we created some smelly messes. And so I put that on hold. But about 10 years after that, other companies start actually trying to do that, creating artificial meat. And you can actually buy artificial meat these days. It's not as popular as we thought it would be, but it's out there. And it may be that the astronauts, that they're going to get fresh meat, it's going to have to be meat grown in the lab. Maybe someday they'll be bringing chickens up there. There was the mouse that roared. They showed a spaceship from a tiny little country going to the moon. And it beat the Russians, it beat the USA, this little country. And one way they fed themselves is they had chickens. And so they eat eggs going to the moon, and then they would eat chicken coming back. So it was kind of like a life cycle type of approach, but that's actually pretty good thinking for space. So then eventually I've jumped back into space-oriented sorts of things. I've been a teaching associate for astronomy courses. This is primarily in Australia, supervising master's projects, some of which involve astrobiology. It's kind of neat. I love the interdisciplinary nature of space sciences because with astrobiology, you're bringing together biology, but you're also bringing together a bunch of geology and cosmic sorts of things. For instance, the different sorts of radiation, the abundance of different sorts of elements in different places. For instance, in the galaxy, some parts are more metal rich than other parts. Some parts are a whole lot safer for life than other parts. And it's all just very interesting. And then had been involved with something called Singularity University, where I was on their space and physical sciences faculty. And we would bring together 100 some of the best and brightest students together from around the world. These are graduate students or professionals to look at exponentially growing technologies and take these technologies and address and try to solve a global challenge. So some of the companies that came out of this were some of our faculty created something called Planet Labs or Planet. They're the satellite company. Several of our students created something called Made in Space, which was originally just trying to put a 3D printer on the space station. Now they've become a major space contractor called Redwire. We may get back to them in the space plant sorts of things. And so that was very exciting. But, you know, the thing in space is if we really want to get people into space, we're going to have to feed them. And you can bring prepackaged stuff relatively inexpensively to low Earth orbit International Space Station. I know I'm jumping ahead, but I realized to get people in space, you have to have regenerative life support systems. I'm certainly not the only person who's said this many people have. And it seems like plants are that. So then I started getting more into sustained space. Sustained space has been blogging about life support in space and sustainability purposes for Earth since about 2008. So we go to events, we go in the labs, we talk to the scientists and blog about it. And then we want to try actually get this plant part of it going. And so that's why we created Orbital Genomics. And that's kind of what brought me over here to this point.
Excellent. And Mark, as you mentioned, um, we can't, well, for long periods of time, obviously, we can't ship food. We can't do it indefinitely from Earth, whether it's plants or whether it's chickens or anything else. When we think about plants, obviously, we think about calories, and plants, of course, are food. But there's so many other things. They are, and I worked in the sort of the phytomedicine business for several years. I mean, they're the original source of many of the pharmaceuticals that we have. They're incredible sort of biomaterials factories for producing things like some of the recombinant proteins and vaccines nowadays that we have. And then they do all the other important stuff for us, right? They generate oxygen, they get rid of carbon dioxide, they recycle water. So, I mean, clearly there's a major reason why we need plants for long-term space habitation. That being said, can you introduce us? We'll get to orbital genomics in a minute, but can you introduce us to the Hudson Alpha Institute for Biotechnology? Because this is where, sustained space, which is where you're focused on the Orbital Genomics project, is within the sort of larger nonprofit research organization down there in Huntsville. People might not be familiar, especially the international people listening and watching, to sort of the space ecosystem down there. I wonder if you could introduce the institute, and sort of where sustained space sits within it currently.
Sure. Some of your audience may be familiar. Space Camp is down in Huntsville, Alabama, but there's a reason Space Camp is down there. And so the U.S. space program kind of began using the word very loosely, with an engineer called Goddard, who built these small rockets. Literally, they could fit in your hand. But that was the cutting edge back then. But during World War II, Wernher von Braun was creating these big, giant, multi-story rockets called V2 rockets, and they're being aimed at London, and they're causing a terrible amount of havoc. But after the war, uh, the U.S. had Van Braun and some of the German scientists move over, with a bunch of their leftover V2s, move over to the United States. And there was an army base still is an army base in Huntsville. And they created something called the Redstone Arsenal. And anyway, so that became the center for rockets in the United States, developing rockets, building rockets, not launching rockets. Although they test parts of them there, they would launch them elsewhere. And so there's this company, and then a bunch of private companies have sprung up around Huntsville. And so there's all sorts of rocket companies. So it's amazing. It's just incredible. Like if you go around Silicon Valley, for instance, you see all these, Meta, you'll see Google, you'll see all these tech companies. Well, Huntsville's just like that, but for space stuff. So you see miles on miles and miles of rocket companies, rocket factories, research labs, facilities. It's really exciting. And literally in the middle of this, in the middle of the high-tech area, is the Hudson Alpha Institute. And the Hudson Alpha Institute was created by Mr. Hudson to investigate genomics and the new technologies related to genomics and biotechnology. And so if you go there, it's actually a pretty large campus. It's larger than all university campuses, where they do a lot of sequencing type of work. They research things. They look into new plant varieties. They also have kind of an incubator and an accelerator for startups over there. They're doing amazing work, and they're very kind of integrated into, they're not just ivory tower folks. They actually have lots of farm fields surrounding their research institute where they're doing lab work, greenhouses, that sort of thing. And they actually reach out to a lot of areas of Alabama and even nationally.
And so as mentioned, orbital genomics is one key aspect of what you're focused on a sustained space to make what we'll sort of broadly call astroculture happen. And I think this is a really interesting place to start because, and again, for people that listen to the show and watch it, a couple of years ago we profiled Colonel Samantha Weeks, who at the time was with the Polaris Dawn program with SpaceX, and they were studying radiation genomics there to say, okay, how does all this radiation stuff affect astronauts? But plants, in addition to radiation, right, up there are going to be exposed to everything from microgravity, hypergravity, fluid dynamics changes, just like humans are. Not to mention, okay, we got no magnetic fields, we don't have the microbiome that we normally think about. It's a lot of stuff that is going to be impacting and stressing the plants. We got to pick the perfect cultivars. Now, we think about things that we work on down here, like salinity resistance and drought resistance. Obviously, that's a big one because not a lot of water up there. But walk us through a little bit about, how you think about, all of these stressors when you're looking at, getting these perfect genomically optimized cultivars for astroculture, what you're working on. Does microgravity come before radiation, before magnetism? Walk us through a little bit of what's happening with this very specialized endeavor because it's key to making the bigger picture happen.
Okay, so there's a couple of ways to look at stressors. One is as a problem, and the other one is as an opportunity. Clearly, some of these things are problems with growth space. I mean, especially if you think plants are vulnerable, the astronauts are even more vulnerable. There's radiation, and there's the International Space Station, which is a couple hundred miles above the Earth, in orbit above the Earth. So if there's a big solar storm, they've got to run into the radiation shelter on the space station, in case it would go and do bad things to them. But actually, they're relatively well protected from radiation in low Earth orbit. That's one reason the space station is in low orbit, for radiation protection. However, once you go beyond about 400 miles, you start encountering the Van Allen belts, and they have magnetic fields that kind of stop a lot of the radiation from reaching low Earth orbit and the Earth. Thank God for us, and we'd probably be dead or be a lot different if they didn't exist. But once you get beyond that, then you start dealing with some of this exotic radiation, and that can be a problem. Another stressor for the space station is it's just hard to grow things. And a lot of the things that we take for granted in the Earth, like clean air, don't always exist in places like space stations. And so you've got to deal with that as well. So I'm going to talk about this also being an opportunity, because, for instance, if you're out in radiation, really nasty cosmic radiation, you can simulate some of that from the Earth, but there's other types of radiation that are harder to simulate on the Earth. You're going to have weird things happening to the genes. You may actually discover genetic effects that you wouldn't be able to see in the environment on Earth. And some of this even applies to low Earth orbit as well. And you may actually have new genes created that do all sorts of amazing, useful things in space. For instance, the Chinese have shown pictures of like 10-foot long cucumbers and zucchini and squashes they've grown that have been derived from space varieties. I don't know if those have been scientifically verified, but at least so there's some of the claims that are being made. Isn't that pretty amazing? And supposedly their number 2 strain of wheat is derived from essentially wheat grown in space. So there are those possibilities. And we found some interesting effects as well, although they don't necessarily show up in photographs as dramatically as that. So both problems and opportunities caused by these stressors.
And obviously, you're doing all the work in studying these cultivars and perfecting the best, the genomically optimized stuff. But then that's only part of the picture because clearly, once you have the perfect cultivars, let's say, now we need to go further because there's a whole sort of stack of other engineering issues. And I'd love to hear, how you think through some of these. Clearly, I just got back a couple weeks ago from Epcot, and obviously they still have the old NASA USDA systems there. The big picture here is ultimately these closed loop life support systems for the plants and dealing with everything from water. And I'd love to hear about sort of what how you think about water, right? But also obviously fertilizing the microbiome, all the other stuff that comes into play, even in the perfectly, closed hydroponic system. Now it's up there as well. Walk us through sort of what how you think about sort of the next level of engineering here, because clearly those systems challenges are probably bigger than the genomics part. So take us down that path, Mark.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And at this point, I'm going to get a little political without being political. Uh, every time there's a major initiative in the United States to like try to go to the moon or go to Mars, they need to build bigger, bigger, and bigger and giant rockets and things like that, hardware, um, to get to and from places. And I totally understand that without the rocket, you can't get to where you want to go. However, the way they fund those, they sometimes increase NASA's budget, but often to fund those things, they'll have to like cut a whole bunch of other areas at NASA, and other space agencies perhaps had this issue as well. And so every time like we try to build a big new rocket, um, like space biology gets cut. For instance, I believe space biology is getting cut quite a bit right now. There's a study, the decadal study, related to this that says we actually need a budget 10 times what it is to try to do what we want to do biologically in space. So we talk about putting 1 million people on Mars. Elon Musk talks about that. But we haven't really talked about how we're going to feed them. And it almost seems like food production and plant production is an afterthought. So with that context, there's been a lot of research done on plants in space. And what I mean research is, maybe dozens and maybe a few hundred experiments over, say, the past 50 years. So there's definitely been work done in the area, and that shouldn't be dismissed. It's been very important foundational work. But really, there hasn't been the quantity and variety of work done really needed to advance this to get the perfected cultivars. Heck, if we're just trying to figure out what cultivars will actually grow in space, and to be a little specific, so seeds have been taken to space. They've come back and been able to grow just fine. Usually taking seeds into space, those are the earliest experiments, isn't usually problematic. Most plants will grow in space, and a lot of plants will flower in space. And not every type of plant has been done, but a variety of different types of plants, a variety of plants have been done. So we can say this universally. Getting plants to grow to flower and then produce seeds that are viable into the next generation of plants, that's only been proven for really a handful of species and varieties. So let alone, and so Orbital Genomics had looked at trying to grow plants in space and do successive generations to adapt them to space, because that's how plants, you don't have to have transformed over the years. Humans have been changing plants for thousands of years. In ancient Carthage, for instance, they're very, very good at using pollination and things like that to create better and improved varieties of plants. That part isn't rocket science. If you want to change actual genes by inserting genes, that kind of is rocket science, but you can actually do a lot by just pollination and seeing what adapts and then taking whatever adapts, and taking the generation of the best adapters and then taking their offspring for even better adapters and better adapters. Unfortunately, we have not had the funding and I guess the capability in space in terms of growth chambers and things like that to do that. So in terms of engineering, that's what we really need. We need more growth chambers on Earth. You can't put a huge giant wheat field in the space station. That's just not going to happen. You can get a little bit closer than we are. For instance, there's talk of inflatables. There actually are inflatables in space where you can have a less expensive chamber. You fill it with air and it fills with and it kind of blows up like a balloon, and then it has a pretty big volume that's relatively inexpensive, lightweight to take up into space. And you can hopefully grow a lot more plants in those sorts of things. As I said, plants aren't as affected badly as like people radiation-wise. If a plant gets cancer, it's no big deal. It's a big deal for that plant, but it's not necessarily a big deal for the humans. And so that's where we have to talk about. One, doing a lot more research in space and creating the physical capability to grow plants to solve the seed to seed challenge. And for instance, there aren't bees in space. but on bees and insects on Earth pollinate plants. So either you have to have these astronauts literally hand pollinate the plants. And if you do this in a lab, maybe Ira, you've seen this, you're actually taking dead bees and taking with the tweezers and take their butts from flower to flower. And that's how you manually pollinate things if you don't have live bees. So there's been talk of robotic bees, maybe all different sorts of ways, or even bringing insects on the space station. One thing is that NASA is quite risk adverse, understandably, and so they don't necessarily want a lot of loose insects running around the space station.
Cool.
You've heard of computer bugs, of course. The original computer bug actually was a moth, and it messed up a computer. So imagine a bunch of bugs on the space station and all the harm they could do. So NASA is quite risk averse about just letting bugs and even uncontained plants on the space station. So we have to find alternative ways to do that. So that's one of the hardware challenges. But the more stuff you get up there, the more you're going to develop and build out your ecosystem. And once that gets going, then I think you'll reach critical mass and be able to start optimizing the varieties that you want for space in a much more meaningful and faster way.
Yeah, we had last year we had Michael Roberts on from the International Space Station National Lab, talking a little bit about sort of the logistics and getting experiments up there. And I was just wondering, obviously there's limited space as you're mentioning, and I don't know how much is dedicated to human health, biotech versus ag tech versus other things that are happening at the space station labs now. But I mean, obviously, if there was no limitation, I mean, what are, some of the plants that probably are the first things that you want to do more experimentation of up there? Are there, as you're pointing out with the bees and all that? I remember too, we had, it was Ian Watson at the Pentagon who was, in charge of, biodefense stuff, and he was involved in sort of this planetary protection plan, which had a lot less to do with, an Andromeda strain type thing coming down to Earth, but the stuff that we're putting up there and concerns about, if a certain microbe that's important for the plants mutates and does something else, we don't want to contaminate Mars and all that. Any interesting little stories like that along the way as you think about these experiments that, yeah, I'd like to do that, but this is a problem. The challenge is still, and even doing sort of the smaller scale experiments on the space station.
Yes, ordinary plants actually outgas things that can be problematic to other plants and sometimes humans. Not all plants do that, and not all plants any time. So on one hand, these gases can actually kill or harm plants. On the other hand, sometimes you need them for the plants to function. So they're sometimes good, sometimes bad. For instance, tomatoes tend to ripen better in the presence of some of these substances. And so you need them for certain things.
Yep.
And so there's actually little absorbers for when you don't want them to absorb it and get it out. So that's something we don't have to worry about on Earth because the atmosphere just dilutes it and takes out. And the space station you build to harmful levels. What's really ironic in terms of control is for carbon dioxide. Plants need carbon dioxide. That's how they generate. Like we breathe out carbon dioxide, they absorb carbon dioxide, produce oxygen that we humans then need to breathe. But sometimes the CO2 level builds up so high on the space station, at least I've been told by NASA scientists, at least one scientist, that can actually kill the plants. So it's a fine balance between the right amount of carbon dioxide. Now, NASA's good at the engineering thing. They actually, and this affects growing plants in space too, or the will to grow plants, or the risk tolerance. If NASA has a problem, they like to solve it with like a lot of machinery and energy and things like that. For instance, they can zap things, heat things and things like that. They're not so good with the biological stuff. I mean, they're engineers. I mean, biology is more complicated than some of the chemical processes. I can give you an example, for instance, a few stories. We were talking about water. NASA is actually pretty good, not just NASA, probably the other space agencies as well, at recycling water. they'll debate how much that they want me to say, but I've seen figures that put it in a lot of figures that put it minimally at the low 90s, and in some cases in the high 90 percentiles, like even 98%, maybe even 99% for some of the stuff they're building for deep space. So that's pretty good. So water itself won't be in shortfall, at least anytime soon. And if you're on the moon and Mars, you may be able to harvest water locally. That's still in debate how much and exactly where, but there's evidence that there is water in both of those places. And presumably, there's a good chance they'll try to land astronauts, at least at some point, in proximity to where they think the water is. Don't want to verify before spending all the money. But there's spacecraft right now just trying to learn about that, monitoring that. So, but the way they do it isn't by giving it to plants and then having the plants breathe the water into the space station atmosphere, then condensing it out. They will zap it and then they'll want to sterilize it. And so that 1%, they can actually kind of isolate that, but the process requires them to put so many chemicals into it to make sure it's really all sterile that you can't really do anything with that 1%. Maybe you can use it as rocket fuel or something, but you certainly can't drink it.
Right.
So for low Earth orbit, where you can replenish frequently, that 1% is not a big deal. Even the 5% or 10% is not a big deal. 90%, just think of all the weight they're already saving by recycling 90%. But you're in deep space. The moon's if low Earth orbit is expensive, the moon is very expensive, and Mars is, I won't say prohibitively expensive, but approaching prohibitively expensive, then that 1% becomes a bigger deal because it's 1% multiplied again and again and again as you recycle the water. So if you recycle the water 10 times, that 1% turns into 10%. And 100 times, it's 100%, literally. The math may not be exactly like that, but that's just a pretty good way of expressing it. But on Earth, we have plants doing a lot of recycling of water, and biological processes can sometimes be much more benign than some of the chemical processes. Chemical processes are more certain. In some ways, they're more risk-free, but they don't really, at least our current processes don't capture, they don't close the loop as much as some of the biology does.
Moving from, biology to, some of the other areas that you focus on, and I know you spent a lot of time. I know this goes back to your Carnegie Mellon work, where you work on this principle of telepresence, and then sort of the ability to use technology to allow a person, not just to see something, but feel and act as if it was in a remote location. And this sort of ties in sort of to sort of this concept, the robotics connected to space agriculture. There's a nice little set of other technologies that go beyond the biology here. And I just love to hear, what you're thinking about at the company, what you're currently doing in sort of the telepresence space, how AI, you feel that, feeds into both managing future space farms and all these important variables, but also having the robots out there too, performing these duties that are kind of tough in some of these environments. What are you doing on this front? A lot going on.
Sure. Just to speak to Carnegie Mellon. So I do what's called technically telepresence. Mostly it's essentially connecting people and looking at in the equipment sorts of things. I'm one of the heavy duty robot people at CMU. I just kind of like immerse myself in the environment. CMU is some of the best robots. And if robots take over the world, as some people predict it will, and CMU has the best robots, in my opinion, then I figure, when they take over the world, they'll be benign to those of us who work at CMU. So it's a big motivator there. But they're doing all sorts of things with robotics. It's amazing to see what they're doing. So my role in robotics and what I think telepresence is important for space is, as I said, you have simple things that are simple on Earth, such as pollinating plants, that require a significant amount of time. And the more intense you have the agriculture, the more human time you may require. Now, engineering, eventually, we may be smart enough to reduce that time, but it's going to take a while. There's going to be a learning curve. So you're going to want to use technology to bridge the gap. Astronaut time, as a general principle, is very expensive. Sometimes you see the astronauts, just blowing water out of a tube and making these cool bubbles and stuff. That certainly isn't where most of their time is spent. They're doing a lot of operational work, experimental work, repair work on the space station. Spacewalks, for instance, are just one of the more famous examples. But I mean, even the preparation for a spacewalk and the recovery for it is substantial. You want your astronauts doing that, not holding little bees and stuff. So um, if you can, at least for things that are close to the Earth, relatively close, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, the moon even, um, you can use telepresence to address a lot of these things. For instance, it takes about a second for radio waves to get to the moon and then maybe another second back. And your technology may add some latency, but the technology is getting better. We're talking about having all these satellite communication satellites in orbit. We actually do have quite a few already. We're talking about getting more and better ones, and better communications to the moon. So it may be possible to have farmers here on Earth, techie farmers, controlling like robotic arms and devices in real time on the moon, and in space, nearby space stations, to actually do the work that farmers and astronauts would be doing in the plants. For instance, you use robotic arms to do the pollination, to do the harvesting, to move the plants around, to change things. And that can be done on the Earth if you have the telepresence equipment. So there's already a fair amount of telepresence to do certain things. If we could further develop that, then we can overcome one of the major challenges to plants in space, and that is just the amount of labor. For instance, there's all sorts of debates about how, we don't even have enough laborers in the United States to work our own farm fields. And we've got over 300 million people here. That's why there has to be a lot of labor brought in from other places to work in the farm fields. Well, it's a lot worse than the space station. Just imagine that problem multiplied by a million, and you can kind of vision the labor problem in growing plants in space. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but I'm not so sure it is if you want to grow plants in volume. But you have people here, you have experts who know a lot about plants, who know a lot about manipulating technology. Hook them up through telepresence devices, and have them teleoperate the farm equipment in space, and then you can overcome one of the big bottlenecks. So I'm very excited about that. And you might say, well, there's a little bit of latency, so maybe they can't do everything as quick as they'd like. Well, we have AI and we have edge computing, and so you may be able to complete what it needs to do in that last half second, especially if it's something that's done before. And so you can use, like I said, edge computing to just maybe fill in that little last half second gap, or if there is some unexpected latency. So the problem is different from Mars. Mars, it takes like literally, depending on where Mars and the Earth are, it takes easily 20 minutes plus for radio waves to get to Mars and maybe another to get back. You're not going to be having astronaut farmers on Earth doing teleoperating equipment on Mars in real time. So you're going to have to, maybe AI and automation are going to have to be further developed there. Although you can certainly have farmer astronauts on Earth monitoring things. I would call them teleastronauts on Mars. But for the moon, and that's where we were talking about putting all these things on the moon right now, trying to create some sort of permanent presence on the moon. Definitely, I think this is where you want to go.
So, yeah, that being said, and say in the fantasy scenario that Mark Ciotola, tomorrow you're, put in charge of NASA with an unlimited budget. I mean, we're, um,
Oh,
for
that's
people
a
that are,
fantasy. That's quite a fantasy. I love
still,
that fantasy.
whatever. Let's just do that. We'll play a little game. Still, you see there, you have a $5 trillion budget now, whatever. Um, Take us from where we are, because what do we see most? We see Mr. Musk and SpaceX and all that, and they're doing stuff with their rockets. Fine, they're perfecting transportation. You've talked a lot today about biology and agriculture and a little bit about the AI and telepresence. I mean, what else do we need to do? I mean, there's a lot of other things that need to get done to create, sort of these self-sustaining, and I don't even know what category, what ultimately, if someone says, yes, now humanity is a self-sustaining off-world, culture. We're not just on Earth, but we're, here. We're a moon culture now, or whatever the case may be. But where are we? Where are we going? What are the technologies beyond what we've talked about today that you would like to see further incubated that maybe aren't getting the money and the attention that they should be? Take us out a little bit, if you would, Mark.
Okay, as you kind of alluded to, we need more growth volume in space, a lot more growth volume. Um, and then if you had the telepresence, you could actually deal with that volume and make it productive. Try to grow the variety of plants, grow them generation after generation, so that you have a true generation of plants that are true creatures of space. They're descendants of plants from Earth, just like astronauts maybe 1,000 years from now will presumably be descendants of humans on Earth, but they'll be probably adapted and evolved for space itself. And who knows exactly what that will be. That's the great thing about evolution. It adapts to things in ways that you can't even think about. It's kind of like dumb intelligence. What it does is it rolls the dice again and again until it gets the right answer. It's like if you're playing craps, but you get to keep on rolling until you get what you want, and then that's when you collect your money, right? That's what evolution kind of is. And so we want that capability to have enough critical mass up there so that these types of processes can start happening. One thing that I think that I'd like to see is just create giant modules in space, put a bunch of different types of plants and maybe some small animals in there too, and like literally kind of seal it off, or at least mostly seal it off, and just let it sit there and see which plants live, which plants die, which insects and animals live, which animals die in that space environment. And come back maybe 5 years later, and you're going to see a system that's evolved for space, and that's probably then what we should be building out further.
Gotcha. That's really cool. Space-based evolution.
Yeah, kind of like a space meadow. That's one of the terms we throw around for that.
That's cool. It's a cool concept. Um, what else is going on with you, with the company, other research initiatives and collaborations that you're involved in, and anything else while we have you today, please. I mean, each topic is
Sure.
equally exciting, but again, love to hear, what else you're working on.
Okay. One thing that we've been discussions is, with Alex Harkis at Hudson Alpha. And by the
Hmm.
way, so I'm with Sustain Space. So we're an affiliate company of Hudson Alpha. Alex
Yep.
Harkis is actually faculty there. We've talked about duckweed, and I've in discussions with other startups too. So duckweed's an interesting thing. We talked about the
Oh
pollination
yeah.
problem. Duckweed can grow what's called monoclonally, which it does have flowers. They're really tiny. You don't need a microscope to see them, but it can just
Hmm.
like divide like bacteria. And so that overcomes some of the problems. Duckweed creates other problems, but that's one of the promising foods for space. So that's exciting. I've been trying to grow it, see how it grows under different conditions, think about the hardware that you need. And there are companies that are working on that. There's a company in Colorado that's working on that as well. There's a team of college students. They won a competition from NASA, got $10,000. They're looking at duckweed. So that's exciting. But moving on to what also Orbital Genomics has been doing is we're trying to make it more attractive to business. Funding has been a really big issue for trying to grow plants in space. So we need more funding. And in agriculture, we've looked at portfolios. For instance, the University of California has a public portfolio, at least of their more successful crops. And if you could look at each one as an investment project and then bundle them together into a portfolio, then you can actually reduce the risk and come up with some sort of expected, or maybe a little bit optimistic, but expected rate of return, something that investors are familiar with and maybe invest in. To do that, though, to make it attractive, you need to move what's beyond what's called the science lab stage, where you're just trying to test and see, does this effect exist? Will this
Sure.
plant grow? Into the point where you're actually prepared, where you found effects that exist in microgravity in the space environment that are commercially valuable. And then once you get to the point, then you can make it into an investable project. And then once you have found several plants, varieties, and experiments that fit in that category, you put them into a portfolio. Even if you do like 5 or 10 or especially 20, you can reduce greatly the risk. It's like an exponential decay curve on that. So what we're doing is we're looking for effects and experiments that have shown promise, and we're still looking. There's some, but we feel that if you get several more, that's something you could pitch to investors.
Excellent. Yeah,
And to further develop that, we've proposed, actually it's something we proposed for the Deep Space Challenge. It didn't win, but it's still on the drawing board, is kind of a space super farm where you have, like literally you get a whole rack on the space station, not just 1 cubic foot or in a small, accordion type of thing, but a whole rack, a bunch of different plant chambers, different varieties that could support a whole portfolio of plant experiments. Right now, there isn't the capability to support a portfolio of plant experiments, but have proposed a hardware design where you could do that.
Mhm. It's interesting you mentioning duckweed before. I'm familiar with that one, and I remember back in the day some of the companies that were trying to use it as a platform for recombinant proteins because it grew so damn fast. And yeah, it gets me thinking about, the potential for sort of not just uh the growing plants for calories in space, but also sort of the connecting the medicine angle again, and a lot of the things that are pretty tough to make down here, and potential to make them sort of space farm applications. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential here. I obviously it should be funded a lot more to the degree that it is, but it's great what you're doing in terms of continuing to get the ideas out there and move these stories forward, because they're you know, they're indispensable in terms of making us that spacefaring civilization. So again, it's impressive work that you've been involved in. Anything else public facing coming up for you, Mark, while we have you today for 2026 as we get into 2027, in terms of other conferences, talks, other teaching initiatives that you're going to be involved in, and anything else on the calendar that I missed while we have you today, please?
Oh, trying to put together kind of a summary and industry report to attract interest in this field. I'm really looking at delving into what's being done and what's being proposed from a critical angle. You see a lot of press releases, or at least some press releases, about great new greenhouses are going to space, things like that, and then you don't really hear things for a few years. There's one initiative, so we're looking into that, and my colleague, Olivia Ma, she's often looking through the literature to find things. She's found several effects that she thinks are valuable. But another initiative is the Plants for Space in Australia. And they do have a whole bunch of funding. I don't know how long it'll last, but they are doing all sorts of things, building hardware, creating experiments for plants. They haven't flown a lot yet, but they're going to try to flow more. And it's that type of big integrated effort that I think has a lot of promise that we're trying to encourage and get more involved in. There's the Melissa effort, which is a closed loop life support thing by ESA that has existed for a long time. And we're looking at ways to kind of nudge those things kind of into the future. And with all the proposed developments on the moon and Mars, we think it's actually a pretty good time to be doing this.
Awesome. Awesome. Great work. I look forward to continue to follow you, Mark, to help you spread the word about what's going on there, Sustain Space with Orbital Genomics Project. But again, I'm rooting you on. Again, for everybody out there that is going to be listening to this episode across the various podcast networks, or who will be watching on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Mark Ciotola, Chief Executive Officer, co-founder, Sustain Space, doing amazing work to create these resilient biologic systems capable of not just supporting our expansion into space, but helping to create at the same time more sustainable civilization here on Earth. Mark, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while. Thank you for everything you're doing there at Sustain Space, and as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create technologies that will create a better tomorrow for all of us. It's a great story, and I look forward to helping you share it and continue to follow you.
Thank you, Ira. It's been a pleasure.
Really great having you.